Okay, so what I got from listening to your podcast and reading parts of the book was that aside from core gender being bullshit, it seems that we evolve, like everyone evolves their gender conception of themselves over time. We never just arrive at a place, although it seems some people might, but it seems like we actually don't. I'm putting that back to you.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think we certainly, one of the things we're arguing in the book, we're arguing very strongly against the notion of gender identity as a core, as some sort of immutable core, whether it's an immutability rooted in biology or an immutability of a kind of like such a dense psychological sensibility that it's fixed. And instead we see gender as an unfolding process. And for some people, that process may be more marked or markable, such that they can even narrate a process of transformation. But even someone who was assigned female at birth, say, raised to be a girl who will become a woman, and for whom that identification as woman fits more or less well, even that person is going to experience changes in how, in her gender, how she's read by others, how her body and gender feel to her over the course of her lifetime. So that the transformations might not be as grand as someone who comes to understand themselves as non-binary or as trans, but they're transformations nonetheless.
How is what you're presenting within psychoanalytic theory different from queer theory? Are there differences?
Do you want to take this? Because I would actually like to go back to the earlier question, but do you want to take this since you also teach queer theory?
Sure. So I think this is a great question. I mean, we are drawing in the book on queer and trans theories, in particular queer and trans of color critique. We could not have made the arguments we made without our engagement with those materials, those resources. But and queer theory, from its time of emergence, say in the early 90s, much queer theory has engaged with psychoanalysis. So to sort of bring together psychoanalysis and queer theory is not new per se, but I think one of the things that's very different about what we're doing is we're also writing this book as psychoanalysts ourselves. So we're drawing on our experiences in the clinic, what we're hearing from the people we sit with, once, twice, 3 times, even 4 times a week and over many years. So we have a different interest in sort of an individual's account of themselves. And I would say that, and I'm really curious what you think about this, Avgi, that queer theory is invested in social constructionist accounts of gender and sexuality, right? The ways in which gender and sexuality emerge culturally and historically. These categories are not the same from one historical period to another. They're not the same from one culture to another. And certainly Avgi and I would agree with that. But queer theory in the main really can't give an account of an individual's experiences. It gives us really wonderful and supple macro level accounts. But I think when it comes to the individual, it really has less to say. There's still more generalized accounts. And this is why, early in the book, I think it's actually in the preface, we recount the story, an experience I had in the classroom long ago. I was in an LGBTQ studies class in which a student, basically raised their hand in the air, as more like a fist, and said, I get it, gender, sexuality, socially constructed, but what made me a lesbian, right? And actually queer theory can't answer that question, right?
Do you feel psychoanalysis answers it? Like you're finding—
Actually, this is such a great follow-up, because I was just going to jump in to say psychoanalysis can't either.
But it doesn't not answer it from a different perspective.
Okay.
And I want to say something about why this matters, because psychoanalysis cannot answer it either. Like anybody who tells you this is what happened to you and this is why you're queer or straight or this way or another way is kind of like is more invested in your story than in exploring your story, which is kind of like always a problem. But what psychoanalysis adds that I think queer theory kind of like has, I would say, an oblique relationship with is the theory of the unconscious, and a way of thinking about how there's like strange forms of agency that don't come from like, I choose to do this. I mean, people choose what to wear, how to present themselves gender-wise, like whether to wear heels, makeup, kind of like what kinds of like sexual accoutrements to use during sex, like, you know, what kind of toys. All of these are decisions, right? But they're also responsive to other things that kind of like have to do with how we understand our sexuality, how we understand our gender, how they feel in our body. And these are not just a matter of categories. They have this strange relationship of agency that is not fully volitional, like I choose this as opposed to that, like when you go to a supermarket and you choose this product as opposed to the other product. Because you choose from a limited array, and you choose in a way that is always constrained because of the culture you're in, because of how you grew up, because of whatever kind of like unconscious deposits are now in you through your kind of like primary relationships, your parents, your siblings, your social groups. So we end up with a way of giving sort of like an account of gender in a way that allows for the possibility that our gender is not just some internally derived truth that we either accept or don't accept, but it's something that we all kind of like knit together from all kinds of materials. And what's important in this is not just what your gender ends up feeling like to be at any given moment. Like I feel like my gender is like, I feel as a kind of like I identify as a woman or I identify as non-binary, but that the process through which you arrive at this kind of like Polaroid of every moment of what your gender is not just answerable to the outside, though it's also influenced by the outside. That you kind of like, there's always this play between our internal agency and the facts of the world, the materials of other people's wants and desires through us. And that's how we end up actually how we land on one of our most provocative suggestions in this book, which is that even trauma may have something to do with gender, all gender, which is kind of like really verboten to say out loud in academic discourse, even though in queer communities we talk about it.
I want to explore that because that was the other thing that I definitely saw come up here. But I want to first ask, can you explain what is psychoanalysis current theory of how we come into being then, whether or not we're queer or cis or whatever? Like, what are the things that, like, are we believing in reading dreams these days? Like, what is it that entails psychoanalysis now? And then how did you each separately come to psychoanalysis as the thing that you feel helps explain who we are?
I mean, I think Avgi and I will like pass the baton back and forth here, but maybe the first thing to say is there's no one way in which psychoanalysis answers that, because psychoanalysis very early on became multiple. So, you know, since psychoanalysis is identified first and foremost with Freud, and his particular theories, say, of the unconscious and his interest in dreams and in slips of the tongue, things that are not, in which our consciousness, in some sense, our control over our consciousness goes offline and things slip out that were not something we would have allowed ourselves to want or meant to say, right? So it's an interesting way of thinking of how, as he put it, the ego is not master of its own house, right? Like, oops, you know, like things are happening I didn't mean, right? But even Freud kept changing his mind. So even Freud was multiple early on. And then they're all the followers of Freud and the followers of the followers, such that no one's really following anymore, right? So psychoanalysis couldn't give any one answer to what you just asked. But I think that one of the things that maybe in general psychoanalysis sort of offers us is if you take seriously the unconscious, that there are aspects of the subject that will never be mastered by that subject, that we can never fully know ourselves, that it does complicate what agency means, right? So that it also pushes back against, again, the will not only to self-mastery, but also the ways in which that will to self-mastery can often manifest in mastery over others. I think some of the violences we do to others to exert our control in the world may potentially, psychoanalysis could help us think about, may even be a reflection of our failure to master ourselves.
So you're saying the right wing, their desire to control everybody else is because they have zero control, or they have zero understanding of their unconscious selves.
Well, here's the thing, none of us do. I mean, actually, none of us has full knowledge of ourselves, right?
Okay, but they have less knowledge of themselves.
Yeah, go ahead, Avgi.
I was going to say, like, I appreciate the impulse to want to figure out, like, what is happening with the right now, and is that what will answer it? Mm-hmm. But, you know, so as Anne was saying, there's many psychoanalysis. The psychoanalysis that we're working with, but all of them share one feature, and that feature is that we're always foreign to ourselves. So it doesn't matter how thoughtful you are. Like, even if you've been in a 20-year psychoanalytic treatment 5 times a week on the couch, like the most classical kind of like orthodox form of treatment, there's still aspects of yourself that will remain foreign to you. So psychoanalysis is not about discovering everything. Like when you were saying, like, do you still believe in dreams? The notion of belief implies that there's something in dreams, and either you believe that they show it to you or you don't. But the dreams are a way of dreams, slips, errors are a way of manifesting, surfacing the foreignness of ourselves to ourselves. And that foreignness can feel very uncomfortable. On the left too, I mean, I'm thinking kind of like in the clinic, how many trans people have I not heard say to me some version of, but if I'm trans, I shouldn't be doing X, or I want to wear this. But as a trans person, I feel like kind of like it messes too much with kind of like how I understand my gender right now. So there's always like this foreignness to ourselves that can't quite be captured in categories. I mean, this is one way to think about the difference between some queer theory and psychoanalysis. Kind of like that psychoanalysis always says that identity can never fully encompass who we are. And that the most interesting and even bizarre, or at times even grotesque to ourselves, things about ourselves happen on the margins of the identities that we work so hard to forge, so that kind of like you may feel at home in an identity. And of course, we absolutely believe in this book and kind of like in our clinical lives and in our personal lives that kind of like rights kind of like are important, that identity gives you a way to speak to the state, to petition the state, to petition other people, to use your pronouns, to use the forms of address that resonate with you. All of these things are true. And there's always something that slips. There's always something that is in excess or doesn't quite fit that puzzle of identity. And that is the element from which our gender can always transform, not in the sense of, well, you think you're trans, but you're not, because I see that you're doing X. Not that way, which is a way of exerting control over another person. But like I have, for example, I have a patient I've been working with for a very long time and about whom I'm speaking with permission, their permission, who, when they first started their treatment, they came in identifying as trans non-binary. And they were very worried about wearing the clothes that are usually associated with the gender they were assigned to at birth. So like they were assigned female at birth, they were missing wearing clothing that is usually seen as feminine. During the course of the treatment, they came to identify more solidly as trans, kind of like, and I say more solidly in the sense of like something became more organized for them. And they felt, you know what? I don't need the non-binary part anymore. This is who I am. And I would say like this is a mutation of gender. Like one could say, oh, this is just somebody working through their ambivalence and just firmly landing on I'm trans. But I think another way to see it is that their gender shifted during the course of the treatment, not in the sense that I converted them into trans, or that perhaps not even that they discovered that they're trans, but that something coagulated around a different center. And even in this new formation, they still have things that don't quite fit. So now they're experimenting with like doing different things with their makeup. And it still causes this discomfort around whether they're really trans or not. And in our effort to get rid of this notion that somebody's really trans, or not really trans, because who is ultimately, not only have we never been able to measure gender identity, because it's a fictional concept, it's made up, it's completely made up. It also takes the analyst or the clinician or the legislator or the teacher or the parent out of the position where they just need the right tools to judge if somebody's gender is valid or not. Like gender and validity have nothing to do with each other. All genders, cisgender, transgenders, non-binary genders, genderqueer genders, like none of these have any relationship to truth.
So what I get is that our inner core or is sort of, it's molten, it's fluid. So because whatever comes out to the surface is never the fixed thing, what is the goal of psychoanalysis or the development of one or maturity of a human being? Like, what are we to hold on to as, you know, the center of ourselves? Do you know what I mean? Like, I know that gender is one part and maybe our ethnicity is another part, and what we do. We have all these things that make up ourselves. But gender sort of sits really at one of the first stages of how we identify others and ourselves. So what is the thing below that then? Like, what does psychoanalysis help us hold on to so that we can navigate all of our different stages that we might go through?
I mean, I think that the idea of kind of like when you're asking what is the thing below it, you are implicitly drawing on this image of almost like an onion that has, like, if you peel back the layers, right, you find something true at the core that maybe has been distorted, you can't see it clearly, or it's given a certain form. I think that one of the ideas that we're working with is that at the kind of like at basis, the human psyche is transformable, and it can take many different forms depending on a variety of different factors. And I know that this sounds like very general, so I'll say something a little bit more specific, that my patients, for example, shift from understanding themselves as cis at some point, to understanding themselves as trans non-binary, to understanding themselves as trans now. Like, this is not like, it doesn't have like a destination where, okay, we finally got to it. Like, for all I know, in 2 years from now, something will have shifted again in a different way. And that doesn't mean that the previous identifications were wrong or problematic, or they hadn't quite gotten there. We're all projects in development. And this is also what makes people anxious, because if there's no final destination, if there's no true self that we are looking to, what are we even affirming? What are we even, why are people even having like hormones? But the truth is that like life is lived like this in a variety of different ways, except when it comes to gender or race or the kinds of categories that we think of as having to be fixed and indexed to the body. So the body should tell you what race you are. It should, I mean, this is also beginning to sound kind of like quite kind of like, this is the same path from which you end up with like a lot of racism, right? Because if the body tells you what race is, then there's certain kinds of features, right? The body should tell you what gender you are. And the old story used to go that true transsexuals want to fully transition to look like the opposite gender, so that their bodily morphology matches that gender. I mean, these are all projects of canonizing people into specific forms. Like, this is the true way to be this, the true way to be a Black person, the true way to be a Greek, the true way to be kind of like disabled people think this, like, and what that eliminates is precisely that foreignness to ourselves, which is the place from which we can constantly transform. You don't have to accept that for it to be there. Just like you don't have to, like when we were talking about the pandemic, we used to say the virus doesn't care if you believe in science or not, right? Like, it doesn't matter whether you accept that foreignness in yourself or not. That is there and it's doing different work. The question is, how much do you try to tame it and capture it in categories? And how much do you hold yourself back? So I would say that the goal of psychoanalysis is not any particular end formation. It's more about having the suppleness psychically to allow yourself to transform in ways that kind of like do not feel like they're completely damaging you or threatening you, or to allow yourself the moment where you are thinking, I want to wear eyeshadow. And rather than go into a panic of, but this makes me not truly trans, or to go into the pushback of, fuck everybody, I don't care what people say, I'm going to wear my eyeshadow, as a way of like externalizing that internal conflict. But so you wear it, but you're still looking to see who's trying to fuck with you, and then you get very aggressive with them, right? To actually allow these things that you yourself, through this queer agency of the unconscious, are coming into contact with, and allowing yourself to shift. This doesn't mean that your gender will shift. It may be that, you know, you identify as trans or non-binary now, and you will always identify this way, but it remains to be seen. You can't know in advance.
But the shift, I mean, I'll also say that maybe there will be a different kind of shift, so that I'm thinking here about, let's say, normative gender, you know, that it is certainly the case, given that even with the expansion of how people can self-identify and have their pronouns and self-identifications honored by others, and this is tremendous. I mean, there has definitely been improvement on the score. We yet live in a world that's organized on the premise of binary gender, right? At the founding marks on our birth certificates, on our licenses, such that trans and gender non-binary people have to go through a lot of bureaucratic and legal maneuvers to change these legal markings, right? So we live in this world still organized around binary gender, and there are profound stereotypes associated with each of these supposedly only two markings. So someone who identifies as a woman, so someone who's cis feminine, may well suffer from very rigid notions, not only of how others think, what others think it means to be a woman, but what she thinks about what it means to be a woman. Similarly, one could say that someone who's, you know, a cis hetero guy may actually toil under the pressure of what it is to be a stably heteromasculine subject. So one of the shifts might be not to help that woman realize that she's really a trans guy, or not to help that guy realize that he's actually non-binary, but to have a flexible relationship to the gender that does feel right to them, so that in fact there's less, the masculinity is less toxic, say. Femininity feels less like a straitjacket. There's more room to breathe and move within it. So a less rigid experience of what it is for that cis woman to be a woman, for that cis guy to be a man, right? That's a shift too. We don't usually call that a gender transition, but it's thinkable as a gender transition. It's a shift in relationship to it.
To have this inner strength to be comfortable being able to do that, or be in oneself and be comfortable, like that seems a monumental feat in and of itself.
Monumental.
Which I'm guessing is what a part of the process that you go through when you're dealing with clients. So
yes.
What does it take to, like, you know, like I was, you know, some of the examples that you gave of the clients here, like, you know, you could see there's a struggle with so many forces going against an individual who's trying to form themselves. So that I don't know what the right word is. Psychology has these words for these things, right? Not all of your clients might have some essence that is going to push through and say, I have the strength to go through these different expressions of myself. You know, like, what is that thing? That's the thing you're bolstering, right? That you're trying to bolster some invisible force within us that allows us to feel strong enough to say, hey, you know what, mom and dad, or my friends, my queer community, I'm actually doing this right now, and this is where I am, whatever. Like, what is that thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, to go back to something Avgi said earlier, certainly the way that Avgi and I understand what psychoanalysis can offer and what psychoanalysis can do is not a search for the truth, some hidden core feature of the self that we and our patient will discover together. Or even worse, that the psychoanalyst knows and is just waiting for the patient to catch up, right? That is so arrogant, A, and B, we don't actually think there's some one truth, right? That it's a matter of discovering. But what would it mean to create a space within which someone gets to be curious about themselves and in which can be a scary process. So when we say that we're offering a safe space within which someone can be curious about themselves, that doesn't mean that project of curiosity is always going to feel so hunky-dory, right? It might actually feel terrifying at times, but can also be exhilarating, right? And it's in that process of, let's say, transformation or coming to understand oneself differently, that is still not going after some sort of like, now we will discover it, now we're going to get to the final form. But this is also not just about gender, I think, as you alluded to earlier, Grace. Like, how does one set up, let's say, operational conditions in which one gets the room to not be so sure, actually not to be so sure of oneself, right? We have a culture, and this, with my, in my other life as an academic, I do a lot of work with, thinking with the work of Michel Foucault, like, what does it mean not to have to know the truth of ourselves? We live in a culture in which subjectivity is absolutely indexed to truth. We're a true subject, truth of gender, truth of race, truth having to do through particular kind of religious self-understandings. What does it mean to say, actually, none of this is true? There's room for other kinds of things.
No, I wanted to also respond to your question, because within our fields of psychoanalysis and mental health, this is the kind of like one of the key questions. Like, the way that you framed it is like, what is the essence in us that you're trying to, in a way, fortify? And, it used to be that the idea is that you have to fortify the ego. Like, the person has to be strong to be able to withstand these things. But as Anne was saying, and I'll use somewhat different language here, like, to be able to go out and tell your friends, like, look, you do you and I do me, and this is who I am. Like, this stance has been sold to us as a liberatory stance, and it has been sold to us by the left and by, quote unquote, progressive politics. And I say sold to us because how seductive is it, and how lovely does it sound that you get to say to everybody, back off, I'll do me. And I know this from the clinic, what I'm going to say, including from trans people who have cut off contact with their parents. You can stop talking to their parents because they're toxic. And if you need to do that, you need to do that. But the real work around this is your internal relationship with your parent. It's your internal relationship with what you think is expected. So you may set those limits and, quote unquote, advocate for yourself on the outside. But it's also the internal work that one needs to do that is very critical here, of what does it mean to be a singular being? To not answer to the party line of this is what we queer people do, any more that you answer to the party line of this is how women are supposed to be. Because these party lines come from a variety of different directions. And we are not on safe ground by saying, okay, we're on the left, or we are like our queer community, there's always the seduction of being pulled into some master narrative that serves a certain kind of solidity of understanding this or that, but which may not serve you, and which actually we often use to turn away from the foreignness in ourselves. Like, the initial sense of like, this is my home, these are my people, is both the relief of not having to constantly defend yourself. And gradually, for some people, it can also begin to feel like you now are answerable to this group, because if you answerable to you internally to this group, the group may not expect this of you. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But you begin to feel that since this is your home, you also owe something. And it doesn't matter if your home is your chosen family or your biological family or your adoptive family. Like, there's always ways in which we need to go outside our zones of comfort. So there's no essence here that is fortified. We all have the potentiality to be seduced and pulled into this. And we all have the potentiality to be singular, but singularity comes with heartbreak. Like, what does it mean to say, I felt safe here, but now there's no room for X? And I have to decide to perhaps stay within this formation, this social formation, knowing that this part of me will always be missed. What does it mean to give up these fantasies of recognition, of full, complete recognition that we have, and which, of course, are incredibly important? Like, I'm not speaking here about people disrespecting your pronouns or disrespecting your racial identification or disrespecting who you understand yourself to be. I'm talking about how that respect can also become a libidinal attachment that you then have a lot of trouble giving up in order to come into contact, or when you come into contact with parts of yourself that don't quite fit.
What do you mean by libidinal attachment? It means that there's some power that's a desire to...
So it's a desire to stay connected, to not lose our objects, to not feel like we're giving up on somebody or somebody's giving up on them, on us. That this idea, especially kind of like in a culture that Anne was saying wants as few queer and trans people as possible, and that is kind of like really genocidal in its attitude towards trans kids. It is very, very reasonable to see, it's very easy to see how people just want to be recognized and want like the safety of belonging to a group. Like this makes absolute sense to me. I have like no kind of like issue. I have no question about why this is happening. But the idea that there are spaces where we can be fully seen in all of our complexity is such a mirage. It is such an illusion. And it's a very seductive illusion. So if you are to say this group doesn't fully see me, you could, of course, leave that group and go look for another group. And sometimes you may need to do that. But you preserve then the notion that there is a place where you can be fully seen or fully understood. And we only get glimpses of that at best. Kind of like, and when we find those moments of a glimpse, like they feel very powerful, understandably so. But if we start with the premise as we are, that there's always a foreignness to ourselves, like how can somebody else respond to that when we ourselves are unknown to ourselves? And I don't mean this in the sense of like know yourself better, because if you are in enough analysis or read enough or whatever, you will eventually come to fully understand, to map yourself out. There's always something that will escape you. And actually, that's the good thing, even though it feels like the scary thing, because it means that there's always more to who we are than we can narrate to others, than others can understand. Like one example that I give to my students when I teach psychoanalysis is I say, think about the lover who in the first meeting says to you, I want to know everything about you. And that can feel like really riveting. But 4 years in an ongoing relationship, somebody who says, I want to know everything about you is like kind of like suffocating. Like part of what makes the I want to know everything about you is that at that moment, you know, there's an impossibility to that. It's an aspiration, it's a gesture. But somebody who knows everything about you or thinks they know everything about you is in a very different relationship to your own alterity.
There's so much I want to say about relationships, but let's put that aside for a second. So, Anne, I just want to go back to, you're saying that in the clinical environment then, right, that both of you actually are creating the space for an individual to be able to explore, right? This is what I'm hearing you say, to just see what that feels like. It might be scary, it might be what, so you provide this quote unquote safe space or an environment which allows that to happen. But yet we all walk out into this world of so much noise. So, and going back to your book was supposed to be a journal entry that got rejected because a group of your colleagues are like, we don't want this. So like, how does psychoanalysis work in the world? Or does it only work in a small environment? Like how do you, deal with these forces?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is that psychoanalysis is in the world, right? Psychoanalysis is not apart from the larger questions of politics and culture. And thank goodness for that, because social and political changes, including around transness and queerness, have been pushing psychoanalysis, even as it's kicking and screaming against that push, have been pushing psychoanalysis to actually reckon with the fact that its previous theories of around sexuality and gender just don't work, are just wrong, right? Avgi and I are amongst a growing minority of psychoanalysts who are deeply invested in the flourishing of trans and queer life, who think that psychoanalysis's previous ways of accounting for the development of gender and the development of sexuality has been too limiting. And we actually draw resources from political and cultural debates, even as we're pushing back against some of them. So that's the first thing to say. Like psychoanalysis is in the world, right? So it's not as sharp a separation. But it is also true that, and I'm curious what Avgi would say, that there are incommensurabilities between the kind of set aside space of a treatment, you know, with your therapist or your psychoanalyst, and what might happen at your work, what might happen in the classroom, what might happen in the social movement. That these are different kinds of spaces. But ideally, some of the ways in which you're getting to reflect in this set aside therapeutic space may help you to develop more bearing, more capacity for flexibility in the face of the inevitable disappointments in dealing with other people, and the inevitable surprise of coming to realize that you want things different than you thought you were supposed to want, or that you once wanted. And partly, you know, one of the ways I think psychoanalysis can help you develop that flexibility or that bearing of the inevitable disappointment is that happens with that's going to happen with your therapist or your analyst, right? Some things are going to happen in this space that are micro versions of what happened in these bigger spaces, but they're not the same. But things can vibrate in these other spaces as well.
I would add to that, if I may. You know, it's true that we provide the space to explore, but I think it's very important to point this out at this moment. Psychoanalysis continues to be at the leading edge of anti-trans activism in the United States and across the world. So I don't want anybody who's not familiar with psychoanalysis to hear this and feel that psychoanalysis is safe. It's not. In fact, it has been using its architecture, its conceptual architecture, and its means to promote anti-trans agendas. You know, the head of the of SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, which has been characterized by Yale as a pseudoscientific organization and deemed by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-LGBTQ hate group, is led by a psychoanalyst and has many psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic therapists in its ranks. So, and they're using the term exploratory therapy to precisely give the illusion of exploration when, to many of us, and there's a long list of references here that I'm not going to do in the podcast, to many of us feel like their practice is very adjacent to conversion. So I want to say that because there's exploration and then there's exploration. There's the exploration that is passed off as being open-ended, when in fact the agenda is to, if you can help somebody avoid transitioning, why not do so? Which we think is kind of like problematic and not as humanistic, so to speak, as it purports itself to be. And you know, when the journal said to us, we don't want this article, what they didn't want in the article was our explicit welcoming of queer and trans subjects into psychoanalysis, not just as patients, but also as our peers and our teachers and people we learn from and with, as analysts, as our colleagues. So the pushback within psychoanalysis is kind of like mimics the energies of the pushback against trans life in the larger culture, which is what I think Anne was also speaking to. So there is not one, that's why we were saying earlier, there is not one psychoanalysis, there's many psychoanalyses. And one has to be really careful about who they see and who they take their children to. Because we do live in a time that is profoundly hostile to trans children, to queer children, and to trans adults, for sure.
And I would say, adding to that, you know, Avgi and I love psychoanalysis. We think it has tremendous potential, both as a practice. I mean, what a thing to be able to sit with someone and talk to them, sometimes multiple times a week for many years. I mean, this is an extraordinary experience. And then we also think it has a lot to offer as a theory, as a way of accounting for transformation, a way of accounting for, again, these forms of agency that don't start from pure volition, don't start from the side of pure self-knowledge. This is a really different way of thinking the subject, and it does rhyme with currents in post-structuralist thinking and queer theory, right? But so we love psychoanalysis, but we also think it has blood in its hands. It has been complicit in an ongoing way, misogyny, racism and colonialism, obviously homotransphobia, right? So it has blood in its hands. That doesn't mean we throw it out, but it needs to be shaken. And this is, one of the things that we're trying to do in the work is like shake it in its foundations and then build it back up to make it more supple and responsive and capable. This is not about let's just have a woke psychoanalysis. That's not what we're talking about. Not that there's anything wrong with being woke, right? But like a psychoanalysis that is actually more alive to complexity, which is its promise, right? To actually be able to do that, right? And not itself be a psychoanalysis is like itself fixated around identity and certain notions of what a good life is. Because psychoanalysis can be profoundly normative, right? And that's also something we're pushing against from within psychoanalysis, in part by drawing on these resources from outside it, whether it's queer and trans theories, critical race theory, but also the vibrant energy of social movement. Like psychoanalysis needs to let itself be undone, right? Not be so sure of what it thinks it is.
Whenever I hear these kind of situations come up, you're rejected from a journal or whatever, all this pushback, what the right is doing, to me, it's always sounds like just a grab for power or keeping the power structure in place. Patriarchy is more about power than it is about masculinity, right? Masculinity just serves to hold power structures together. So, I don't know. That's how I hear it.
Yeah.
Is that true? Is it true? It's just that men, as long as they hold masculinity and manhood to be this, and we are in a patriarchal society, and if you're going to be in this discipline of psychoanalysis, then this is the structure, and we hold the power, and how we run, how therapy should go is how it should go. Like, is that all it is? Is it just like,
I'm going to say, I'll say the following, and I know Avgi's going to have something more to say about this, but I'll even go back to this journal article, right? So Avgi and I didn't mean to write a book. We had written an article that was going to be published in the oldest journal in the field of psychoanalysis, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And it's important to note, it was accepted for publication twice in writing, right?
If I may add something here, Anne, the paper was not purely rejected. Papers get rejected every other day, every single day. It received a very prominent award that it was on that basis that it was going to get published. So the rejection is actually a symptom of something, even after because it was accepted, we were moving towards publication. And then when we added the footnote acknowledging and welcoming queer and trans subjects into psychoanalysis, that's when we were told, well, we really loved your article before, but take this out or else, which is different than just the article being rejected.
Yeah. Yes, we were basically told if we didn't censor our acknowledgements, right, which are not considered part of the article itself. I edited a book series.
That's more strange. That seems very strange.
I've never heard of it. And I've never heard of it. It's never happened to me in my other writing. Avgi has published books and articles too. Like, it's just not done. So something about our wanting to name whom psychoanalysis has injured, and also to basically say, here, queer and trans people are already in psychoanalysis as analysts, as supervisors, as teachers, and as patients. Like, and this is what we were told barred the publication of the essay. They said, take that out or we won't publish it, right? It had already been accepted. But I bring this up because my hunch is that the individuals involved with that decision at the journal are not right-wing. My hunch is they understand themselves to be good people, even maybe even liberal, right? So these tendencies, right, that what we're seeing is actually the desire to conserve, not in the sense of politically conservative, but to conserve the stability of what they knew psychoanalysis to be, for example, including conserve the good self-image of psychoanalysis. We're not harmful. We're not responsible for that. We're not complicit. And this desire to conserve one's own image of oneself as good and to deny one's responsibility for bad things that are happening, I don't think this is just the tendency of people on the political right. It's very hard to acknowledge one's part in larger systems that harm and injure and from which one benefits, right? And we have all sorts of defenses set up to prevent acknowledging that, to prevent seeing that. And we have a whole culture set up such that some subjects who belong to the dominant center, white, able-bodied, heterosexual, Christian, like cisgendered, they actually often get a pass from having to acknowledge that at all. Like there's a whole apparatus set up so that they can continue to feel good about themselves, even as when, say, a genocide's being, like carried out with their tax dollars in their name, right? So this isn't just about people on the right. It's not just about a power grab in that sense, I think. And I'm curious what you would say to that, Avgi.
I was going to go kind of like in a similar direction to say, and it's not just about patriarchy, it's also about imperialism in the following way, that if binary gender is a Western formation, and it has to do kind of like with how colonialism has gone into different countries and forced them to restrict both sexuality and gender into forms that are recognizable to the West. Kind of like we can talk about so many kind of like indigenous cultures and parts of the world where kind of like American imperialism and British imperialism has gone in and forced through laws, through criminalization, the restriction of gender and sexuality into very particular formations. Then we can begin to see how the destabilization of the binary system has ties not just to patriarchy, but also to imperialism. And one might think, really, like my kid wearing a dress kind of like disturbs the world order, like, isn't that excessive? I mean, your single kid wearing a dress does not. But then the demands that you make on the stage, or the questions that this opens up, the way that then this becomes on a national stage, kind of like one of the big kind of like running points for Republicans right now is kind of like, quote unquote, the trans agenda, kind of like how to stop people from using bathrooms of their choice, how to stop people from wearing whatever they want. Like in the UK, like the entire structure of the healthcare system is being shifted such that to be, if you go abroad and get hormones for your kid, hormone blocking or cross-sex hormones, and you have not gotten them through the proper pathways, and I put proper in air quotes, within the healthcare system in the United Kingdom, then you are seen as being in possession of a substance, of an illegal substance. So here you see how kind of like the national healthcare system and going through the state for approval for healthcare gets tied together with gender and gets tied together with a notion of like substance possession, which is a very racialized discourse. So here you see that it is not just patriarchy, though patriarchy is well a factor in this, but also a certain kind of imperialism and kind of like white supremacy that are very much connected with what's happening with what's happening around trans kids.
So the cleaving to these structures to me seems like this is power and I want to keep this power this way, but and you're suggesting it's also ignorance. Like, I think I'm liberal, but I'm actually keeping this power structure in place.
I specifically don't think that it's ignorance.
Yeah, I don't either.
I think it's power. It's a power.
In the following sense, I'm sure that some people are unaware of some of these connections. And in that sense, you could say, okay, there's things that people don't know. There's even the impulse in some domains to educate people, to show them the links. But, and here's when kind of like this links to what Anne was saying about the genocide that's going on. Kind of like the genociding of Palestinians and what's happening in Lebanon right now. To step out of this is to step out also of the ways in which one is accustomed to live. You can't say, I support trans rights without realizing, I mean, you may not realize how that's connected to imperialism, how that's connected to kind of like projects of colonization, which have been central to the colonization of gender into the binary. But to go from that to being like a good citizen that supports everybody has a right to do whatever they want with their body, like their right to kind of like self-determination or bodily autonomy, misses that you're going to have to give something up. You don't get to live in the world that you're living with all the privileges that you're living as an American, let's say, as somebody whose country is shored up by imperial wars, as a country that we might say whose hegemony over in the Middle East is now being fought through kind of like the nation of Israel, which is kind of like, of course, also fighting its own colonial war, right? You don't get to keep everything unchanged, but just hope for a shift in gender. And in that sense, you have to give something up. And that's something up that you will have to give, like the notion that kind of like the ways in which this country has been kind of like the richest country in the world, even as it abuses its citizens every other day. Like the privilege of kind of like, I'm just going to say something like very simplistic, you go into every country without needing a visa. I mean, that is, you know, as somebody who did not grow up in the States and who holds passports from 2 different countries where I grew up in, like that is unheard of. Like Americans have no idea how much privilege goes into that. The idea that everybody has a border except Americans. Americans get to go wherever they want. Like there are ties between all of these dynamics that are very connected to not just knowing more, kind of like if you knew as an American, then you wouldn't do it. If you knew as an American, then there are all kinds of things that you would see are actually beginning to shake. If you start pulling, it's like a Jenga tower. If you try, you can't move the block of gender without unsettling and shaking up the entire structure. And that's why both the right and the left, I mean, if you think about what happened recently, was it the governor of Texas who said in response to DeSantis's claim that Democrats are trying to kind of like transition kids, he said, and this is a Democrat saying this, like, I don't believe this. I think, I don't have the quote in front of me, but some version of like, I think that boys are boys and girls are girls.
You're talking about Colin Allred, the candidate for Senate against Ted Cruz.
Oh, Senate, yeah.
That's right. That's right. Thank you for pinpointing that. So I think that the more empire is being threatened, especially.
Wait. Can you just, okay. I know you guys live in this like dialogue and you must talk to all these people yourselves and other people all the time, but okay, if I'm following you. So I'm trying to go from the individual then to like governmental genocide, okay?
Right.
So if you start to just question what you believe as to be immovable gender, which you discover it is not, from there, that question leads you to the micro to the macro. Then you see, well, then why is this system set up this way? This only exists because we believe this is immovable and you deserve XYZ because you are an American or you are the American government or da-da-da. If you believe you are a man or a woman or a whatever, then you believe all these. Is that what it is? Is that the tie? Like I'm missing that part.
Maybe I'll try it another way because I maybe go from a different direction because I don't think it's the case that just because you as an individual come to have a different sense of your own gender, such that you come to sort of like think, let's say you move into non-binariness or you move into transness or you have a different, more flexible relationship to your cisness. I don't think that just because you have that different self-understanding, your own understanding of other social systems will change. It may or may not, but not necessarily on the basis of like, ooh, my consciousness is blown and now I'm ready to come out, and be, an anti-racist activist or, activist for Palestine, for example. But maybe looked at I'm going to look at from the other direction. So Republicans have purchased $50 million in ads for this presidential campaign, which they're putting in swing states that are targeting trans kids in particular, right? It's like anti-trans, anti-trans, anti-trans. And so we might think like, what is the relationship? And they think this is winning. They're trying to get those few people that are still movable in terms of their vote, right? Why is this a winning strategy? How is coming out against trans and especially trans kids? How is that connected to other political questions? And so there's something about change, like the ongoing transformations and what is possible in terms of gender, right? Pushing beyond the binary that destabilizes, like what? It destabilizes the notion of like how families are supposed to be formed. If we don't have, stability of boyness and girlness, of who is a man and who is a woman, how will we have families? And how will those families reproduce? Now, how will they reproduce the nation? You start to see how transformations in gender and an expansion beyond the binary doesn't fit with Make America Great Again. Because Make America Great Again is premised on the reproduction of certain kinds of subjects, white Christian subjects, heterosexual and gender binary, right? So there's something about the changes in gender that is actually scary. people experience this as an assault on their American values. They experience this, and this isn't just cynical. Many people genuinely experience these challenges to the gender binary, and the greater visibility of trans kids. Trans children have always existed, right? Or sort of children whose genders have been different have always existed. We now might call them trans children. They might identify as trans, right? But the greater visibility of trans children and trans adults is genuinely experienced by many people as a threat, right? And we have to take that seriously. What is threatening about it? Part of what's threatening about it is it actually shows that, gender is a house of cards. Like it reveals the fiction of it, but it's always also experienced as a threat to one's family, because gender binary is foundational to my family. Gender binary is foundational to reproduction, which reproduces the nation. Like so many other things get connected to it. Does that make more sense? That I'm interested in, why do people find it so frightening? Really, and truly do.
Yeah,
I agree with that, but
so you've taken me from the individual to the family, then from the family to the government, right? Because this is where, we're all basically, I hate to use this example because it's so hot button, but like Israel, Palestine, because the American government is using all of our tax dollars for funding weapons of war in Israel, we are all complicit, because that government holds our families together, therefore holds us. I don't know. Is that the connection of the logic?
I mean, this is not along the lines of what we're thinking, but I would put it differently. When Anne said, like, this is not cynical, these people like genuinely experience it as a threat, I would say that it is a threat, but perhaps not in the way that it is experienced. It is a threat because the moment you say, look, like your kid may be gay, they may grow up to be trans, they may become trans, all of a sudden, this notion of how the state is organized, how the family is organized, begins to kind of like get more rickety. And the moment it gets more rickety, questions of kind of like, think about how much is premised on our everyday functioning on binary gender. And I don't just mean bathrooms, I mean kind of like how you track populations. Like when you describe like a suspect, gender is one of the first things. Like gender is one of the ways in which the state has kind of like keeps track of who is who, right? When somebody kind of like, when we're talking about the fear that this expansion of gender poses a threat to democracy and to American life, right? Because we know what's what, and these people are trying to mess with us. They're trying to mess with our brains. This we might think of as a resistance to the foreignness that trans people and queer people bring to the national project of heterosexuality and the national project of cisness. And it's a foreignness that actually is threatening because it also touches on each one of us. Like the more cis and straight you are, the more vulnerable you are to having something destabilized in yourself. I mean, that's why straight men who feel they have been deceived, and I put deceived in quotes, in air quotes, scare quotes, by a trans woman because they thought she was, quote unquote, a woman, but now they realize that she's trans, and therefore they were tricked into something. It destabilizes their whole sense of who they are, their sexuality, their own gender. So that's the way in which I'm saying that kind of like what Anne was speaking to about kind of like experiencing this as threatening is not just a matter of information or misinformation or education. It's a libidinal investment. You're invested in this version of yourself. You're invested in this version of living in the world, in this version of having access to certain things in the world, in this version of having entitlements to certain things in the world. That's why I brought up passports, not because passports is where it's at, but right. Because passport is one example of what it means to feel that the world belongs to you, that you get to go into the world and decide who's a man, who's a woman, who is kind of like the ways, think about how drag now is being used as gender terrorism is being understood as terrorizing children. This comes from the work of Jose Munoz, and kind of like how the the figure of the
Is
terrorist.
Jose Munoz an analyst, a psychoanalyst?
No, Jose is my former colleague at NYU, unfortunately died in 2013, but a very important thinker and queer of color critique.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So thanks for stopping me on that. So the idea that kind of like there is that cis people are being terrorized by trans people because they could be everywhere, that you have to be constantly watching for who's really who they say they are. How do this whole notion of like, how do you, based on somebody's body, tell if they're trans, if you're going to be tricked into having sex with them or treating them like a man when they're not really a man, they're really like somebody like in disguise. Like all of these are rhetorics that also kind of like we hear in the background of Islamophobia, of anti-Semitism. We hear in the background this notion of like, how do you, on the basis of the body, tell who is who? So all of these things are connected, kind of like not because they're connected, because they're based on the same strategies. And it doesn't matter if you are educated on what these strategies are. You live your life, you have understood yourself, you exist in communities precisely through these strategies. So what you would have to give up in order to not think this way, you would have to give yourself up, because your entire self is organized through this way of understanding the world. So it's not just about saying, oh, I'm gonna, like, my bubble is this big and I'm going to expand it and I'm gonna be more inclusive. You have to allow yourself to come undone. And we see this now with anti-Zionist Jewish people who are beginning in the, kind of like, especially those who in the last year have been thinking, wait a minute, like I was told there was nobody there. That's not the history I was taught. And are coming into a crisis in realizing that the way that they have organized their relationship to their Judaism, the relationship to Israel, the relationship even to the Holocaust itself, has been architected through particular kinds of stories. And that if these stories don't hold, you don't just get to say, okay, now I see differently. Everything has to change.
We've used, I mean, maybe to build on something Avgi said, we've been using the language of foreignness. And I think that's a really interesting term. Like, so by that, we mean a number of things. That the psychoanalysts we're thinking with most in our book is Jean Laplanche. And one of the things that Laplanche helps us think about is that the foreignness that comes into us, things that come into us from the outside, social ideas about what it is to be a human, which are often filtered through the parent. Like, we don't identify with a gender. We're first identified as having a gender by the adults around us, right? The doctor says it's a boy, it's a girl. The parents will know even before the child is born, quite usually, what sex, right? Because in the prenatal testing, it's hard to get the technicians not to tell you, right? So like, you are bombarded with a notion of what your gender is before you get to identify what your gender is, right? That's part of what we mean by this foreignness, these outside forces, concepts pour into you. But the other foreignness we're talking about has to do with the unconscious, that we can never fully know ourselves, that there are always going to be elements of ourselves that surprise us, that are out of sync with what we think we're supposed to be, who we think we are, what others expect of us, right? So that's a different kind of an internal difference with ourselves. We're not self-identical to our own image, right? So this creates the conditions whereby coming into contact with someone who is foreign to our experience, this is not what a human's supposed to be, can shake our own foundations, because they might dislodge or like suddenly open up some of the ways in which we're not identical to ourselves, right? And this is where it's very interesting, right? Like, one of the reasons that Trump was elected in 2016 is this anti-immigrant platform. This is what he's selling now. Let's keep the foreigners out. He means this in a more literal sense. Let's keep out migrants, right? But what if we take seriously that there's a fear of the foreign?
I don't know if this is the right place to jump here, but is this how you see trauma happening? So trauma is an event or several events which dislodge someone, which we've usually read as being a negative, destructive thing, but you're now kind of looking at in a way that it possibly might ignite an opening for a transformation of some kind. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's there is no question that trauma is also a negative thing, that kind of like a violation, an intrusion.
Give me your definition of how you see trauma. Like, is there a definition? Like, how are you defining it within?
Yes. Let me first juxtapose it to how it's usually thought about in larger culture and in much of psychoanalysis. Usually, we think of trauma as something that is so kind of like so massive that it overwhelms the ego's capacity to cope. So you are met with something from the outside that is so overwhelming and so painful or difficult or violating that your own integrity is broken up. And then that puts in motion either it produces symptoms, kind of like dissociation, all kinds of like traumatic effects, disturbances in relationships, and so on and so forth. And then the ostensible goal is to try to patch up the person who was broken by trauma to return them to this pre-traumatic state, right? That's what we call repair. The notion that you try to kind of like have some stitching together of this cut in the human psyche. We call this, in previous work that I've done before this book, in a book I call Sexuality Beyond Consent, I described this version of trauma as traumatophobic. And what I meant by that, and we build a lot on this in Gender Without Identity, what I meant by that is that this way of thinking about trauma starts with the premise that to be traumatized is an exception. It's an exceptional event in the psyche, which, if you think about racialized populations, if you think about certain kinds of subjects, for some subjects never get to have this fantastical notion of an intactness, or of a first intactness, before they're interrupted by trauma. So, for example, like if you're a Black person growing up in the United States in the aftermath of of slavery and the antebellum South, you're not born intact. You're born already with the intergenerational trauma of racial oppression, and of course the ongoingness of it in real time. So we begin by, in Sexuality Beyond Consent, I started by tracking how this way of thinking about trauma is also governed by white logics and certain fantasies about completeness, that there are some subjects who are complete to begin with, and that the goal of the work in the social realm, work in the policy realm, but also work in the therapeutic realm, is to restore that intactness to the subject. And I juxtapose with this with what John LaPlanche calls a trauma, speaks about in traumatophilia, which is kind of like an attentiveness to trauma, by speaking about trauma in a different way, by trauma as having to do with not interrupting like a fully formed, intact being, but trauma as being the constant and inevitable barrage of demands, impositions that come to us from the outside, impositions that come from kind of like the social world, but are always mediated by adults and placed on the infant, placed on the child. These impositions can be like a gender assignment, or it can be an assignment into race, or an assignment or a violation. And that all of these impositions carry with them something really bizarre. And this is kind of like the distinctively psychoanalytic aspect of this argument. They carry something also about the adult sexual unconscious. The adult who says, this is a boy, in kind of like, be it the doctor or the parent or the parenting figure, is imposing, or rather just imposing. This statement has conscious meanings, it has social meanings, and it also has things folded into it that have to do with the adult's own sexual unconscious, their own conflicts about their gender, their own complexities about how they understand sexual desire, about the proximity to an infant that is profoundly vulnerable, about how that infant came to be, about the pairing through which, or the thrupling or quadrupling through that child arrived in the world. And that the child then is left having to tackle kind of like all of this excess that comes from the adult, and which can never be like fully sorted out. Trauma, therefore, in this way of thinking, encompasses both these kind of like capital T trauma events that are kind of like foisted upon us, but it is also just part of what it means to be alive, that we're constantly intruded upon by others, however well-meaning they are, however mindful or thoughtful they are. There's no way to avoid that. And therefore, in this way of thinking, trauma is not just an effraction into us, it's not just a breaking into us. It's also the condition through which we become subjectivized. We become who we are through how we treat, how we process, what we do with that trauma. So a traumatophilic way of thinking is not about becoming like romanticizing trauma or sexualizing trauma or saying that it's not a big deal. It's about saying that trauma does more than just interrupt us. That trauma also introduces disturbances that could then be, in some situations, used to create new forms of ourselves. Think about how many people during the COVID pandemic found themselves in a huge crisis at home, and somehow something either becomes clear to them or mutates in them, and more people come out as being trans or being queer. I mean, certainly you have a large trauma there, but it also puts energies in motions that are worked by the psyche in certain ways, that they produce something new. This is not to minimize that COVID was kind of like devastating. It's to say that more can come out of trauma than just interruption or rupture.
And fixing something that broke. It's not about putting back together something.
Correct.
Exactly.
And one of the things that's so crucial about this, I mean, we're making an argument in our book that's not just counterintuitive, but seems to be breaking a certain kind of political contract. We're saying that trauma may have something to do with becoming queer and becoming trans, because it also has something to do with becoming cis, like that there's no gender that is not in contact with trauma in some way. And this seems like a dangerous argument to make, because anti-trans and anti-gay discourses commonly say, both clinicians say this, but also in larger political conversations about queerness and transness, that if someone's, especially when it comes to trans kids right now, like if a child believes themselves to be trans, they're mistaken. There must have been something bad that happened to that kid, some bad parenting, a bad teacher, the wrong internet site. Maybe they were sexually, molested. Something bad happened, a trauma, and the trauma is the reason why they only think they're trans. So transness here is seen as a pathological symptom of trauma. And if you fix the trauma, you'll course correct that child and they'll be back on the straight and narrow of cisgender. They'll be back on the lane of binary gender that they should have been on all along, right? So trauma is seen as something that causes people to go off course, right? So, but we're making a really different argument. We're saying that trauma actually can provide an energy that can propel people. People might do something with that trauma. And again, we're not pathologizing trauma. And to say that trauma does not invalidate the gender that someone becomes. Mm-hmm. If it invalidated the gender that someone became, then in fact, cis femininity is invalid. Because I mean, here's a really easy example, right? That given misogyny, given the pervasiveness of sexual violence against social subjects known as women, right? It is impossible to disarticulate, to take apart the threat of sexual violence and the actuality of sexual violence from the meaning of being a woman in our culture, right? It is just baked into what it is to be a cis woman, that you have to negotiate the threat of violence.
Yeah. Right? So much so that for some trans women, the first time they're catcalled is the first time that they are kind of like inducted into a social recognition of their womanhood. Right. Kind of, I think that's such a powerful example of how womanhood is kind of like tied together with trauma. And I'm thinking here of how Grace Lavery talks about, who's a queer theorist, writes and trans theorist, kind of like writes about how cis womanhood and trans womanhood are precisely united through kind of like patriarchal and sexist oppression. Right. I mean, this is what, in many ways, this is what makes somebody a woman in our cultures, that we're all wary all the time of being raped.
Right. This leads me to, I think, my last question for you, because I know we've been here for a while. Why do you think that male and masculinity and female and femininity are poles that exist like archetypally? I don't know if that's the right word to use, throughout every culture, everywhere, even though in cultures, as I was talking to Anne before you had come in, I'm like working with Hawaii, and there is space for a third gender, which they called mahu, but with the express understanding that there is still male and female and roles and identities within each of these categories, whether or not your gender is going to match up with that. But everywhere, male, female, what is male or what is female, it exists in our psyche somehow, however we choose to express it. And as you were saying, every culture does it differently.
I mean,
why, Anne, why?
This is like a gazillion-dollar question. And I mean, my first thought is that, you know, cultures are variously making sense of basically the ongoing appearance of other humans. Like, in some sense, how do other humans appear, right? So that, and I don't want to say these are just different theories of reproduction. Maybe that's another way to put it. Because there are theories of reproduction in different cultural systems that, you know, basically didn't imagine that there's some sort of, you know, sort of like egg and a sperm. Like basically the woman didn't have much contribution other than, you know, being the host body, right? Like we don't have to go to biological theories. We could say biological theories are themselves an attempt to make ongoing sense of the ongoing appearance of other little human beings. So there is maybe an attempt to make sense of bodily life. But and you know, we in the West have fixed that as sexual difference, the sexual difference in reproductive contributions. But why should differences in bodily morphology or how one can contribute, if one, you know, wishes to, like the capability of sort of reproductive contributions of a certain sort, why should that then be determinative of gender? Because gender is not the same thing as the biological body, for example, as if the biological body is so uncomplicated. But I do think there's something about trying to, you know, like make sense of and tell and produce myths about, that, you know, there are in an ongoing way more little humans.
So reproduction is constantly figuring into this, describing there's difference, the difference between.
Well, I think, you know, I'm also thinking of something that Freud says in the 3 essays, which is the text that he speaks about gender without speaking about gender, because the word gender does not come into being until the 1950s, where he kind of like tries to think about femininity and masculinity, and he basically aligns them with passivity and activity. I'm going to leave it to you to guess which one is which. But I do think, kind of like, as Anne said, this is the gazillion-dollar question. But I do think that kind of like the notion of the masculine and the notion of the feminine are also put in place to manage and speak to questions of passivity and activity, and therefore of power and subjection. And therefore of who has it and who doesn't, who's kind of like, and you can hear now in the background kind of like feminist voices speaking about like who does the work and what kind of work counts as work and what kind of work counts as like doing things in the world versus doing things at home. But to me, it seems that there's something kind of like across cultures that the feminine and the masculine play with, but in different ways in terms of activity and passivity, because there are kind of like cultures in which the feminine is an active form, but most cultures negotiate some version of activity and passivity through these gendered formations, and then do a lot of work in trying to talk about how they are mixed and not just existing in a solitary, uncontaminated, unsullied way, not in a pure way in any one person, right?
You could rewrite Freud's essays and replace those words. What would you guys prefer to use? Instead of activity and passivity, what other words would you use to describe these forces at play?
While you're thinking, Anne, I would say there is no way out of this. it's not like if we just use different words, because we can't come up with words that are not.
Do you believe in those binaries? Okay, either you're passive or you're active,
No,
and
of course not.
It's the interaction of them.
Of course not. Of course not. Of course, I don't believe that it's either this or that.
And you don't think there's better words for us to kind of understand this dynamic with?
I don't think that there's better words. I think that there's better frameworks, because these words, any word that I might, like, words come to mind, right? But any word that I might propose has its own baggage. So this idea that, you know, what if we didn't call it this and we called it that? But that is also embedded in the same systems of meaning. I try to work through this in Sexuality Beyond Consent through the following idea that consent, for example, think about consent. The question of like who is asked to give consent and what are the responsibilities of the person who is requesting consent. Those are also questions of power that are apportioned between two people, as if the person who is asking for consent is not also subject to something in the encounter, and as if the person who is giving consent doesn't also have a certain kind of power. Now, this is not to minimize that people get raped, that there's sexual violation, sexual harassment, but here you have a concept, consent, that tries to do the work, we might say, that in some other domains would be done through gender. Like it's no accident that when we think of consent, our immediate configuration gender-wise is a man and a woman, and the man is asking, the man may violate, right? So there's so many different ways we have to think about things that kind of like sometimes get compressed into gender, but you just can't change the words if you don't also change everything that is tied to them. And that's what makes this so difficult. And that's what makes this so much more than just a project of better education. It's a project of societal transformation. And that's why I think one way to think about why trans people are experienced as being so dangerous, because they put pressure exactly on those links. I'm sorry that I wish I had like different words to offer and a way out, but
it just allows one to think. I don't know. Anyway, Anne, what do you what's your?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree that, you know, I don't think that. Also, the thing is, to replace those two terms, we're still in a system of two.
Yeah.
Right. And all these words become freighted with baggage. That's the other thing. But the other is that, so let's say, I don't know, we came up with even nonsense words, like instead of saying activity and passivity, we came up with words that, like neologisms. What's the density? We needed a cultural density such that these new terms could take, right? There's not, I mean, Wittgenstein famously says there's no such thing as a private language. It takes at least two speakers, right? But it actually takes more than two for something to start to have a density that can have momentum, could even become social movement, right? So I think it's, we could propose 2 words, 3 words, 4 words, and what's a dent? It's like not even a dent.
So basically your answer is everyone needs to get into psychotherapy, analytic therapy, and start doing some work on themselves.
I mean, I think being in psychoanalysis is an extraordinary experience. And for those who have the opportunity, I highly recommend it. I also think that social movement, right? Like that, what a vibrant thing to be in social movement, because that can also be profoundly transformative, especially if it's social movement in which you're not seeking to be only with people that, as Avgi was talking about earlier, that you think will fully get you. And you're like, you're just like them. Like, this is about solidarities across our differences that will feel uncomfortable. Like, social movement is not about feeling comfortable. Like, I'm thinking with, that there are other places we might go to feel more comfortable. Like, there are multiple spaces in which one needs to work on transformation.
Yeah.
All right.
And I would second that. I would say a psychoanalytic treatment can change your life. And I say this with all the weight and the depth in which kind of like, that's a very weighty thing to say. I've seen people, like, it's changed my life. I've seen people whose lives it's really changed. But social change is not just individual action. It requires something on the social level, and it requires the capacity for a society to allow itself to be undone and redone. This is what the reason why I mentioned anti-Zionist Jews who have come into crisis in the last year, recognizing the actual history of the land of Palestine is because they have been allowing themselves to go into crisis and to rethink, and they will come up with their own new stories of how to relate to the history and to themselves. And that is a lot of work to do. So here's an example of how you don't just need a new word, you need a different set of relationships. That's tremendous work. And I think that it also takes social movements to make that work, even though it's also individual work. I do believe that too.
So
It helps to have company, which is why social movement is so important, right?
So short of going to analysis, get involved with a movement.
Or both if you're lucky.
Well, thank you guys so much. So as